Wagwan. Probably the biggest brow raiser in GTA 3 for many players was when Claude killed Kenji Kasen. Kenji was a big man in the Yakuza, the gang that has been exceptionally good for Claude in the story. Asuka, one of the main faces of the organization, gave Claude a job, a place to stay and much needed security after the Leone Mafia unfairly betrayed him and tried to kill him. Kenji was Asuka's brother, for whom Claude also worked before agreeing to assassinate him.
I want you to kill the Yakuza Waka-Gashira, Kenji Kasen.
This moment serves as one of the best representations of Claude's loyalty trauma, and when we look at his past experiences with Catalina or the aforementioned Leone Mafia, we can see why he made such a decision. However, today we ask the question, what if Claude did give the universe one more chance? What if he put trust in the Yakuza and remained loyal to him? And more specifically, what if he refused to kill his former employer in Kenji for Donald Love in GTA 3? So to very quickly sum up what happened, Claude was working for the Yakuza, mainly Kenji and Asuka. Then, via the Yakuza's police source, he met the rich businessman Donald Love and started working for him too. Quickly though, Donald proved to have little interest in the Yakuza's well-being. He asked Claude to kill Kenji Kasen, a Waka-Gashira of the Yakuza disguised as a cartel member, in order to spark a war between those two gangs, thanks to which the local properties prices would drop, so Love could then buy or rent them for cheaper. Claude, despite his ties to the Yakuza, didn't even hesitate and went on to pull what he was asked of off. This brought the desired effect and the war between the Yakuza and the cartel kicked off for proper. So first of all, there's a few options for Claude on what to do after he heard Donald's asking out. So the first one, Claude openly refuses to Donald then and there to carry the task out due to his good terms with the Yakuza and Kenji. So now in turn, we gonna have a few options as to how Donald would react to such an answer. And first of which reactions would be that Donald would not like it. I mean, like, he expected full loyalty from his workers without giving a damn about their friendships or principles. Simply, if Claude wanted to work for Donald, he'd have to do whatever he wants regardless of what it is. Now, if that was what Donald's mentality was, there's even more options of what he could do in such a scenario. And so the first one is quite optimistic. Donald simply sacks Claude and ends their partnership. And let's go even further with that. So then, what would Claude do after such a decision of his most affluent employer? Again, a couple of choices. First one, Claude takes the rejection and accepts that his ties to the Yakuza are impossible to reconcile with the work for Donald, puts loyalty over money and walks away as Donald wants. But additionally, he also respects his ties to Donald and decides to not inform anyone about Donald's plan to spark a war, which could potentially be bad for the Yakuza, especially that he planned to kill Kenji. Claude, in order to remain loyal and not snitch on neither party, just acts as if he don't know anything and just lets things unfold theyself. But Donald doesn't resign from his plans. He simply uses someone else to get rid of Kenji and spark a war. It's possible, however, that he would change his plans to other gangs, or at least to spark a war in a different way than by killing Kenji at that car park meeting. Cause he could expect Claude to tell on him to the Yakuza, who could potentially set a trap against him up, and simply it would be difficult to fake a war that the Yakuza could be expecting to be fake, right? You know, the Yakuza was supposed to be fooled into thinking that the Colombians actually hit him, not Donald. And since Donald could expect Claude to now tell the Yakuza that he's planning something like that, the Yakuza would not only prepare themselves for a hit, but even if they got hit, they would know that it's not the Colombians, but Love, and thus Donald wouldn't get what he wants and would earn himself a powerful enemy. Therefore, it's more likely that Donald would do a reverse hit. He would use someone else to disguise as Yakuza and attack the Colombians instead. As Donald stated in the mission, the Yakuza and the cartel were far from friends already.
I've noticed the Yakuza and the Colombians are far from friends.
So I wouldn't expect the Yakuza to be able to warn the cartel that Donald would be planning to make them war each other. You know, the cartel would either say, "We don't believe you," especially that Claude was the source, who they wanted dead anyway, or they'd say bring it on, as they probably didn't mind warring the Yakuza anyway. Besides, in the scenario we're discussing now, Claude don't even tell the Yakuza about nothing. What I'm trying to say is that even though he wouldn't, Donald could definitely expect him to, so he'd take precautions either way. And who knows, maybe the big man in the cartel that would get killed as a catalyst could be Catalina or Miguel, but that's going a bit too far into speculation, so let's assume they both survive and some other important member gets capped. So the war would probably get initiated either way. The question is, who'd win it? Notice that in the game, Catalina eventually managed to kill Asuka and Kenji was killed before. Claude, on the other hand, killed Catalina and Miguel was killed either by Asuka or Catalina herself. So I guess we could call it a classic 2-2 draw in the original. In our scenario though, the first hit would go against the Colombians, so the Yakuza would gain an early lead. Now, since Claude would stop working for Donald, the construction site encounter would never occur, so neither Asuka, Miguel, nor Catalina would get killed. Not the same way as in the original anyway. Although Asuka would also never kidnap Miguel, so she wouldn't have all that valuable info she was getting from Miguel in the original, so that would give the cartel advantage. But overall, since the Yakuza would still have Claude on their side and that early lead, as well as they still would have Kenji, such a scenario would probably put the Yakuza in a bit of a better position in this feud. As to whether Claude would kill Catalina, it's hard to tell. The construction site thing would never happen, and as we discussed in another video, we don't know if Claude even wanted to kill Catalina, so let's not get too much into speculation and leave that. And well, the other sub-scenario here is that Claude does inform the Yakuza and warn them about Donald's plans. But well, as we said, Donald would definitely assume that outcome either way, so his actions wouldn't change. And the Yakuza are in an even better position here because they know about the war coming, so they can prepare well. Now, another interesting aspect of that is what would happen with Ray Machowski in the scenario where Claude refuses Donald and walks away. You know, he was the connection between the Yakuza and Donald, so in the case where Donald wants to mash up the Yakuza's business, he looks like a bit of a double agent. Well, if we assume that Claude didn't tell anyone about Donald's plan, then obviously no one would even know that Donald was behind the war initiation, so Ray would not face any consequences. But if he did tell Asuka, there's a few things she could do with Ray. The first one is blunt and simple: get Ray killed. She wouldn't trust Ray and wouldn't want to risk working with a Fed who is friends with people that are willing to go against her organization. Or she would trust that Ray finna remain loyal to her, and despite some of his contacts being uncertain, he wouldn't do anything against her and would warn her if he ever found out that one of his contacts is stirring some shadiness against her gang up. Or she gives Ray an ultimatum: you gotta put Donald in jail if their partnership should continue. Now, Ray could either obey and indeed expose Love's shadiness, collect evidence and put him inside. Then, depending on how fast Ray goes about it, Donald could not even be able to make and carry the plan B on how to spark the war out, so in that scenario, no one would die, no war would be on, and no one would betray anyone. Well, unless you count Claude telling on Don's plans to the Japanese. Or Ray could disagree and take Donald's side and help him fight the Yakuza. So the war would get started and the Yakuza would be in a bad position because they lost their police source, who now works against them for Donald, who thanks to it got access to much vulnerable intel on the Yakuza from Ray presumably. And now going back to the previous sub-scenario, so what else could Asuka do about Ray after finding out from Claude that his contacts in Donald Love wants to mess up their business? There is a fourth scenario. Asuka could use Ray's closeness to Donald to inform her about Love's plans. Since Donald had no problem and was willing to mess with the Yakuza, Asuka would probably seem it most fit to mess with him too. Therefore, Ray would tell on Donald to her so she could capitalize on his moves. For example, she could have his packages stolen. The same thing the cartel was trying to do at the time, as we know from the original. So those two gangs would run into each other whilst trying to go at Donald. Here, the Yakuza would yet again be in the stronger position, same as in the other scenario from before. Donald, on the other hand, would be in proper trouble, since two of the strongest gangs in the city would be going at him. This would probably result in him failing to carry his counterfeiting operation out, and eventually either dying or fleeing liberty. Now let's go back to the choice on how Donald Love could react about Claude refusing to kill Kenji for him. So far, we was discussing the scenario in which he would just end his partnership with Claude and let him walk. As we said, that was very optimistic, and now there's the more realistic one. Donald gets Claude killed in order to prevent him from revealing his plans and to punish him for his disloyalty. So first, what if Claude died? I say the Yakuza would eventually find out via Ray that Donald killed Claude and would get pissed off at him for getting rid of their best assassin. So actually, I expect a very similar outcome to the sub-scenario we've just only talked about. So the Yakuza would want to avenge Claude and would start going at Donald and mash up his business. So again, they would run into the cartel, they would war too, Donald would crumble under the pressure from both the cartel and the Yakuza and end up killed or would escape town. However, the war between the cartel and the Yakuza would be more likely to end as the cartel wouldn't want to kill Claude anymore. I mean, he was already dead. But then there's also a big possibility that the cartel would smash the Yakuza because they would already have lost Kenji and Claude. But since the GTA protagonists are exceptionally good in getting out of certain death type of situations without a scratch, and as Claude is an absolutely relentless killing machine, it would be a sin not to assume a scenario in which Claude somehow survives Donald's attempt to kill him and manages to escape. And now that would be a problem for Donald because Claude had bare backup in the Yakuza and Ray, who I think both would be happy to help Claude get off Love's hit list, or rather to get rid of its author. So here again, Ray would try to put Love inside, the Yakuza would start going after Donald with Kenji still alive, and the cartel would also be on Love just as in the original, so he would be totally crushed and again die or flee. Now, how else could Donald react to Claude's refusal? I see two more very similar outcomes. The third one is that Donald would respect that Claude wants to remain loyal to his allies and wouldn't get angry at him for that. The fourth one is that this whole order to kill Kenji was a loyalty test all along anyway. Donald wanted to check if Claude is loyal to know how much he can trust him himself. So after Claude would pass this test, or Don would simply respect his principles, he'd resign from sparking a war for the Yakuza in respect to their alliance with Claude. Therefore, he would spark a war between organizations with whom Claude didn't have no ties with, or with whom Claude was on bad terms with. The best example would be the cartel and the mafia, who were warring before in the story and both wanted Claude dead. I bet it would be nothing but pleasure for Claude to make them two go at each other again, and that would probably be the happiest scenario. Donald would be happy, Claude would be happy, the Yakuza would be happy, Ray would be cool, and our enemies, so the mafia and the cartel, would be at war and facing trouble. Additionally, we talked in another video on the channel how Claude's killing of Kenji could have been the reason why Donald didn't want to trust him and eventually disappeared without giving Claude a word nor involving him in his counterfeiting fraud that Claude so much helped to set up. This time, who knows, maybe Donald, seeing that Claude is loyal and didn't want to turn on Kenji, would trust him and wouldn't disappear like that. He would take Claude with him and continue their partnership, which would certainly be very lucrative for Claude. Now let's go even further back to the choice of what Claude could do after hearing Donald's order to kill Kenji out. And well, as we said, open refusal could have led to Donald wanting to kill Claude straight away. So in our next scenario, Claude, seeing that coming, agrees to kill Kenji to Donald, but then doesn't do it and instead goes to warn Asuka. And here, we'd probably have a bit of a mix of two scenarios already discussed. So the war would get initiated via a reversed hit. But the Yakuza would also want to mash up Donald as now they saw him as a potential threat. knowing that he tried to fool him into a war with the cartel. The same string of sub-scenarios with Ray that we talked about would also apply here. Now, depending on what the Yakuza would put bigger priority on, they could win the war with the cartel or kick Donald along with the cartel out. Maybe they'd manage both, or maybe neither. It's simply hard to tell because all three parties were quite equally strong. The more interesting option is that Asuka would decide to fake Kenji's death and go start warring the cartel. So Donald thinks that everything went well, even though Kenji would still be alive. She would do that so Claude can still work for Donald and inform her about his business, so she can attack him the same as in the other scenarios. Only that even more effectively, since she'd have info directly from the source, from Claude. And then again, that three-way every month for their self-war would take place between the cartel, the Yakuza, and Donald. Of course, at some point Donald could realize that Claude is telling on him to the Yakuza and have him killed. However, if Claude managed to keep his two-faced identity hidden from Donald, Love would probably get crushed as well and forced to flee the city just like in the other scenarios. And of course, going to the initial choice on what Claude's reaction to Donald's order could be, he could of course always agree to Donald and then not tell anyone about anything. But yeah, then Donald would eventually realize that Claude abandoned the mission, and the same would unfold as in the scenario in which he called him disloyal, but Claude didn't tell anyone about his plans. Let me know if you agree with my theories. What other scenarios do you see, and what other aspects Claude's decision to not kill Kenji would influence that weren't mentioned today? If you enjoyed the video, leave a like and subscribe if you want more content like this. Thank you lot for watching. Respect.